Okay, thank you for coming. I'm Saori Kamano, and I teach at the School of Social Sciences here at WASEDA. So I'll give a lecture from the course I teach here in the Tai Chi program called Sociology of Gender. So I'll start off with giving you a brief description of gender and sexuality. And then next, I will present a few examples of numbers showing gender and sexuality issues, followed by looking at the stories behind the numbers. And then I will introduce gender statistics, briefly on its history, and then about counting sexual and gender minorities. Okay, what is gender? In the 1960s and 1970s, gender was the new term to capture social aspects of division between men and women in the English language. But rather than thinking that gender as being about social differences per se, in sociology, we focus on gender as how people think about the categories of men and women in society. So a working definition I use here is the ideas, understanding, expectations, prescriptions, and prescriptions, that is, what to do and what not to do, a structure and practices related to being a man and being a woman in society. And it is important to know that gender, the difference and the inequality between the groups, men and women, is produced and reproduced in society through social processes. And then how about sexuality, another thing I talk about today. I have here the definition, a working definition by WHO, but rather than going into the detail, I just like to point out the important part, which is the fact that WHO definition of sexuality includes gender identities and sexual orientation. And I will focus on these two aspects of sexuality in the lecture today. And then I'd like to introduce the word SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'm sure you have seen some of these terms, but let me explain one by one, not so much in detail, but just very briefly, as they are often quite, tend to be misunderstood. Okay. So sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. It includes heterosexual, is attracted to opposite gender, homosexual, attracted to the same gender, and more familiar terms like gays and lesbians are classified here. And bisexual, attracted to both men and women, and pansexual, attracted to people regardless of their gender, and asexual, which is becoming more commonly discussed in Japan today, is feeling, not having a feeling of attraction, sexual or romantic attraction to others. And all except for the first group here are considered sexual minorities in the research and in the studies. And gender identity is how you see yourself and how you define, how you identify your gender. And for cisgender, your identity matches the sex you're assigned at birth. And for transgender, your gender identity does not match the sex you're assigned at birth. And there are also terms like non-binary, not identified as this category called man or woman. And at times people use terms like genderqueer, gender fluid. That is like at times people's gender identity change over time, or at times changed by situation, time to time. So remember the term SOGI. I will come back to that later. Okay. So now that we have very briefly defined gender and sexuality, we can move on to the subject of today's lecture. So from sociological perspective, gender and sexuality are core to our society. And it is therefore important to understand how gender and sexuality operate in our society and affect our well-being, our opportunity in society, and so on and so forth. So we hear a lot about gender issues or gender problems, right? The government makes policies addressing gender issues, lawmakers will discuss laws related to sexuality and so on. And here are just some very common concerns or areas of interest that have come up in the public agenda, like education that men and women receive, something of concern to us here today, I think. There's also an issue of economic resources of men and women, and then there are issues of LGBT individuals. At times people ask, what percentage of the population is LGBT? And particularly in places where same-sex couples are visible, people want to find out, like children raised by same-sex couples. And one important way of knowing about these issues is through numbers. I'm not saying that's the only way, that's one way. But it is important when it comes to policy making and lawmaking. So let's take a look at some numbers and then look at what is behind the numbers. Okay, just take a look at this graph. This is about WASEDA University, actually our school. And in our school, we have 40% of women in total. But it does vary by school. And this is a social science school, about 34%, which means 1 out of 3 students is a woman and 2 out of 3 are men. And there are schools with, I don't mean to advertise for other departments, but there are more, there are more women students in these 3 departments and in the school. But there are others, like sciences are quite extreme in a sense, having less than 30% of students population are women. So this is one of the example of statistics, I think. And how about economic condition of women and men? By working, one can have access to economic resources. Right? So this graph here shows the employment rate of women in various countries. I don't know if you can see them or not. But in Japan, 72% in this age group, 15 to 64 years old, are employed in 2023, which is not so much lower, and at times is higher than some of these Western European or North American countries. So now we have seen that about 70% of women are employed. But how about the earnings? How much do they make? The graph here shows how much less women make in comparison to men. In all the countries, women make less than men. But in Korea, women make almost 30% less, and in Japan it's 22%. And you can see the gap is a lot higher in Korea and Japan than in other countries listed here. For example, US, you have 16%, like New Zealand is like 4%. The numbers I just showed you are just presented by research institute or at times by the government, and they're reported in the news and at times the SNS. So we just tend to take these numbers as granted. But have you ever wondered how these numbers come about? And can we trust these numbers? So let's go back to the numbers and start with the basics. Just one example. This is the data we just saw. So for the data on women's employment rate, we need to count women between 15 and 64 to get these numbers, and those who are employed. But how do we find women between 15 and 64? How do we know that they are women, and how do you measure employment status? So even standard data like this requires thinking and decision making, and data like this is important for understanding the state of gender inequality and making policies. So collecting good data is the beginning. And you may not believe it, but data like this used not to be collected. So this brings me to the topic of gender statistics. So gender statistics are statistics that adequately reflect differences and inequalities in the situation of women and men in all areas of life. And more specifically, they have quite a lot of requirements. Data are collected and presented by sex as a primary and overall classification, but they have to reflect gender issues. And they're based on concepts and definitions that adequately reflect the diversity of women and men and capture all aspects of their lives. And even the collection method takes into account stereotypes and social and cultural factors that may induce gender bias in the data. So this is kind of ideal gender statistics. Okay. So considering the importance of the numbers, data, making sure that one is counted becomes as important as the data itself. So in other words, act of counting and of data collection is an effort that can create justice if we make data count for all. And thinking about data, we're just talking about implementing good practices of integrating gender in national statistical systems, which can provide a basis for promoting gender justice. So as I said, gender statistics you're exposed to today are not more like a relatively new phenomenon. And there was a time in history when data we can tell you about today were not really collected systematically. And let me just give you a brief history of how gender statistics came about. In the 1970s, there was a growing recognition of need to disaggregate data by sex to understand gender disparities. And international organizations like UN, they did advocate. And starting in 1975, this UN World Conferences on Women, and onwards, they highlighted the importance of gender statistics. So every time they meet, they come up with some kind of suggestion. In the 1990s, various ways to express gender inequality were developed in areas such as education, health, employment, political participation. And international organizations also developed some guidelines. And in the 2000s, gender perspectives began to be integrated into the national agencies and national government in not everywhere, but parts of the world. So one example of how an effort to promote gender statistics can be seen in this example of unpaid work, which is housework and caregiving work. So feminists had been discussing how housework and caregiving work women do is undervalued, and despite making a lot of contribution to our economy. And by taking more gender-sensitive perspective in statistics, they developed a way to measure such contribution, quantify it, and making it visible. So this, I won't go into the detail, but this unpaid work is one example that's something people didn't pay attention to, but finally was recognized, and now is counted. And they got incorporated into statistics. And when they actually counted in ILO, it turned out to be like 16 billion hours people are spending on this unpaid work. So far, we have been just talking about men and women as two groups. But a new keyword needs to be introduced here. It changes the way we think. That's intersectionality. So it is a recognition that men and women are not homogeneous groups, and instead, gender intersects with race and ethnicity, intersects with sexual orientation, gender identity, and at times not just one, but multiple things. Gender intersects with race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, migration status, maybe disability status, and so on. And in the statistics too, in the collection of data, in 2010s, people began to pay attention to this intersectionality in that. So there are efforts to be inclusive in gender statistics and try to recognize this diverse gender identities and sexual orientation. So here we come back to this word SOGI again, And I'll talk a little bit more about SOGI statistics. So what about statistics on SOGI? In the past, researchers and activists in the field have collected data primarily for understanding the health disparities and social issues faced by sexual and gender minority individuals. But in the 1990s, international bodies began to recognize the importance of including SOGI in the data collection. And starting in 2000s, we saw increased advocacy in the inclusion of SOGI questions in national surveys and censuses. So deliberately counting and collecting data is directly connected to making certain groups count and visible. So we see here almost the international organizations drawing up guidelines and recommendations to address the data gap related to sexual orientation and gender identity. And thanks to these efforts, we now begin to have, still not so much, but we begin to have some data on SOGI in some parts of the world. One example, OECD put together the data on percentage of adults identifying as LGBT, lesbian, gay, or bisexual in various countries. And of course, ways of measuring did vary among countries, but this gives us some kind of sense. And most importantly, this counting gives us message that sexual minorities count in society. There are other examples like this. Surveys in China showed that 70% of Chinese respondents knew at least one LGBTQ person, and 52% of respondents said same-sex couple should be able to marry, and then 53% said LGBTQ people should be accepted by society. How about socioeconomic characteristics? Okay, it is found that in 2021, 17% of all who identified as LGBT in the United States were living in poverty. And in terms of health, a careful analysis of 2015 data found that 66% of transgender young adults have thought about suicide. So these are staggering figures indicating serious social problems that need to be addressed. And a more recent study in the US is found that 700,000 cohabiting same-sex couples, and about half of them are married. And from the multiple data sources, they estimated that 14% of same-sex couples in the United States are parenting minors, children under 18. So when we collect data on men and women, we rely on respondents to tell us their sex, men or women. But how do we collect data if we were to take an intersectional perspective and recognize the diversity of sexual orientation and gender identity among men and women? So let me take you through the process of how questions in surveys are asked and how data are collected, beginning with an example in the United States Census. This is not very good screenshot, but census is a survey conducted by the government to count its population and their various characteristics. So this is the question, part of the question used in 1990 census in the US. And they usually ask one person to be a reference person in the survey, and that's person one. And then for each household member will answer how they're related to this person one. So this is a response of person two, and in this case, person one and person two are both male. And how about the relationship? They said person two is a husband and or wife of person one. So if you answer this, what happened was they actually, in calculation, the sex of one party was changed in 1990, and they are counted as a husband-wife being, it's an assumption that husband and wife only can happen in a heterosexual couple. So they are counted, although there are two males, but when they answer this as husband and wife, they are counted as male-female couples. But there's another option, which is shown here, that if they can also answer as unmarried partner, depends on how one feels. If they feel they're related to each other as a husband and wife, they answer this. But if they think they're not married, and then they can answer this one. So if you answer this, even in 1990, they were just counted as how they responded. But in this way, they kind of erased one particular type of relationship in the process of counting. And this is 2000 and 2010 questionnaire. And again, you have options husband and wife in both years. And as I said earlier, even in 1990 and continuing in 2000 and 2010, if you answer unmarried partner, and then they will be counted as same-sex couple, but as unmarried partners. How about if you answer husband and wife in 2000 or 2010? At least they remain as same-sex couples, but they were changed to same-sex unmarried partners, although they chose this response as husband and wife. But big change came in 2020 when the questionnaire itself provided options like opposite sex unmarried partner, same-sex, sorry, it's the wrong, okay, let's look at here. Same-sex husband, wife, spouse, and the same-sex unmarried partner, the circle just moved. So these two options are in existence, and they're counted as responded. So when the Census Bureau released the results, you can see that you have this married couples household, opposite sex, same sex, unmarried partner household, opposite sex, same sex, and these are really tables they release officially as official statistics. So if you don't pay attention to the diversity in sexual orientation or assume that everybody is heterosexual or only heterosexual people live as married, we do lose data, and we make some groups or some way of living invisible, like same-sex couples living as married in the United States. So they were saying that they did not count until 2020. Okay, now, does Japan count same-sex couples? Okay, this is the Japanese census questionnaire. And as in the United States, you have person 1, person 2. Of course, you have person 3, person 4, so on. But just look at 2 persons. They're asked to write their names, and then first they're asked to write their sex. So in this household, this is the response of a lesbian couple who are living together as married. So they both check female in the sex question. And the next question, relationship to the household head, the person 1 decided to become the household head in the questionnaire as a representative. And then person 2, you need to think how this person is related to the household head. So she chose spouse of household head. And in marital status question, they both answered married. So incidentally, marital status in the Japanese census allow for the de facto marriage, like living together as married without submitting this official marriage registration papers. Even in instruction, it says, this is an instruction given in the census form, indicate the actual status regardless of official record. So they don't want to know whether you have submitted that official paper or not. They want to know how they're living. So this couple, as it was instructed, they answered like this. Okay, so this is the answer. They answer as living as married. But what happens in the counting, though? Okay, this is what happened. Now, how is it officially treated? They decided to change the spouse of household head to other relatives by the Statistical Bureau, and all the committees discussed about this and decided to change like this. So this way, although this lesbian couple answered as same-sex couple living together as married, they are counted as some kind of household made up of relatives. And unlike in the questionnaire in the US, there's no option like unmarried partner. So this was the only thing. And of course, these couples felt they are married like this. So this is how you can see people are changing that way of counting and making particular couples invisible. Okay, so much for the couples. What about LGBT individuals in Japan? Do they count? Okay, up until 2010s, there were not much public discussion about the percentage or number of LGBT people in Japan. But obvious change occurred in like 2015 when an advertising company, Dentsu, released the percentage of LGBT to be 7.6% based on their survey. And this number has received a lot of media coverage, and also even academic papers quote this number. And the press release by Dentsu actually said, okay, there are 10 million people in Japan are LGBT. That's 1 out of 13 people. Okay. And in 2020, they did the same survey again, and now they showed its percentage is 8.9%. And Yahoo News covered this result. This is on the right-hand side. They have this is a capture from their news, which said in the headline that the percentage of LGBT in Japan is 8.9%, which is the same as percentage of left-handed persons. Okay, so needless to say, percentage I just introduced by Dentsu did have some impact by making people visible. But now let's stop and think about this number. Is it accurate to say that 8.9% of people in Japan are LGBT? To answer this question, we need to look at how the data are collected. And the Dentsu survey used registered internet survey monitors as their respondents. So these monitors are those people who voluntarily registered to be participants in various surveys. They're always recruiting in the like part-time job site, please become one of our monitor, and things like that. And by answering any survey offered through the company, they receive some kind of monetary rewards. So needless to say, people registered, they have to be internet users, and also they kind of like these activities. They just do this as on the side at times. I know some students also register and participate too. But so these monitors are a special type of people in a way. So their responses cannot really tell us about the whole of Japanese population. And then, if we were to count LGBT in the whole population, how can we go about it? Well, I and my research collaborators actually have done this, and it's the first of its kind in Japan. But instead of asking the monitors, we needed to conduct a population-based survey. A population-based survey, just have explanation here, but in the population-based survey, the findings are the whole structure and whole method we take, you can really generalize to the whole population. And Japan actually has many population-based survey conducted, but not on this topic, but on other topics. So Japan has a history of conducting population-based survey in many different topics, but they have never asked SOGI in the questionnaire. So the problem we faced was that we don't know how to ask questions on sexual orientation and gender identity in such surveys, because the questions need to be understood by people who do not necessarily think about sexual orientation or gender identity. It is not as simple as asking your age, asking your years of education. So just let me take you through the steps of how we figured out how to ask SOGI questions. So we looked into studies in other countries, including United States, and this is just an example of United States. So in US, they did a lot of research on how to ask SOGI. They did it for more than 10 years. They have a lot of accumulation of various knowledge. And for sexual orientation, they suggested this particular question at the time when we were thinking about conducting survey. So instead of asking, are you gay or lesbian or heterosexual, we just asked people to just check, do you consider yourself to be heterosexual or straight, gay or lesbian, or bisexual? And you just check one. For gender identity, it is, rather than asking directly about transgender identity, decided to get at the transgender status, which is the difference between these two. Your sex assigned at birth and how you describe yourself. And if these are the same, you will be classified as cisgender. If there is a difference, and then they will classify as transgender. So these questions at the time were suggested as best practice for asking SOGI. Now the question is whether we can use the same questions in Japan, where social contexts regarding sexual orientation and gender identity are so different in the place where the best practice questions are developed. So we needed to test the questions in Japanese context. So we provided many different ways of asking, change the order, change the explanation, and then we tried to receive feedback from people. So we did, like, for example, we did focus group interviews, which is like a group interviews, and you give the questionnaire, have them answer, and then get feedbacks. And the result is this: we came up with this particular question. This is the question we identified that turned out to be the best measure of sexual orientation in the Japanese context. So what did we test when we were testing this sexual orientation question? One difficulty lies in having heterosexual people understand the question and answer it correctly. For people who are not heterosexual, a lot of times they have thought about these issues. So when questions on sexual orientation like this one comes, they kind of know what they're talking about. But heterosexual people who haven't thought about issues, they think, what is this? Because in a society where everyone is assumed to be heterosexual, they might not have this conscious identity as heterosexual. They just tend to think that there are gays and lesbians out there, and they themselves are not like them. So that's it. So therefore, we decided in the response option to have this phrase, heterosexual that is not gay or lesbian. Actually, this phrase was used in one of the earlier US studies. And it seemed to work in Japan at the time. And another issue is whether or not to include an explanation of each term. Ideally, since we're asking about sexual orientation identity, we don't want particular explanation about their behavior. But when we are getting a feedback, they said it's kind of difficult to understand all the terms. So we listened to them and decided to give, like, for example, asexual, and in bracket we have those who do not have sexual or romantic feelings for anyone. And finally, another issue we encountered was what to do with like others. Like, a lot of times it's easy to just add other option in this type of thing. But then if you have other option, people tend to just check it without thinking much about other options, especially in the questions they are not used to seeing. So we figured out these are probably the better options. One is about sexual orientation. They do not want to decide or have not decided. Another one is, I do not understand the question. And this seems to work better than having others. How about gender identity? Here's the question we used. First asked sex assigned at birth, and in the US, best practice, and then you just go for their gender identity. They have this, how they express it themselves. But when we just asked these two questions in Japan, a lot of respondents said they're just being asked the same question. Why ask the same question twice? So we had to think about this particular second step, which is to ask whether the current gender is the same as your sex at birth. And only those who answer different gender or have a sense of discomfort were asked about their current recognition. So this is what we used in our real survey. Okay. So the percentage of LGBT in Japan based on population-based survey in 2023 we conducted end up having, if you just put LGBT together, it's 2.6%. If you put asexual also, and then 3.5%. Well, as I mentioned earlier, so what, right, you just got this number, and what's the meaning to it all? But there's more to just, in addition to just finding out, okay, there are 3.5% of those aged between 18 and 69 LGBTA. We have more things we can do with this type of data because we ask so many other questions about the conditions they are living in. So by knowing each person's sexual orientation and gender identity, we can compare like LGBT with heterosexual people or transgender with cisgender people. And actually, the whole motivation of conducting a population-based survey was this comparison. We can make this type of comparisons and have these findings generalized to the whole population, not just registered monitors. So this is an important contribution. As I mentioned early on, numbers and statistics are basics for fact findings. So the important part is about whole population. And here is one example of using the comparison, how we compare well-being by SOGI based on this population-based survey. This graph shows the percentage breakdown of the score called Kessler's psychological distress scale. And this is that actually percentage breakdown by the level. And this orange part is the score of 13 or more, and that indicates severe psychological distress. So just focus on this orange part. Okay? So for cisgender, this orange part is 7.5%, while for transgender, it was 25%. How about this one? This is by all the sexual orientation, as you have seen all this section. For analysis, we put together homosexual and bisexual together, but what it shows is for heterosexual is 7.0% for these people with severe psychological distress, and for homosexual bisexual group is 21%. So we can see from these numbers how Japanese society is experienced by sexual and gender minorities. Can say that LGBT persons seem to experience more LGBT persons seem to experience severe psychological distress. Okay, I guess you're tired of seeing numbers and hearing about numbers today, but in lecture today, we saw how certain groups of people and certain issues are counted or not counted in the field of gender and sexuality. And we also saw how act of counting can make a group or issues visible and give a position in society for us to think about and make changes. But we also saw how act of counting is not so simple like measuring SOGI. And we also learned that we need to be aware of how the numbers are generated. Like, is it monitor-based survey or is it population-based survey? So in the related type C course I teach, we will explore more about social factors behind this counting and not counting, and when's counted, how each numbers tell us about gender and sexuality. We'll look into like historical and social factors behind these numbers. Like, for example, result we just saw, what gives sexual and gender minorities psychological distress? Of course, we will talk about method of collecting data too. And I have presented all the numbers, but of course we'll look into a lot of case studies on people's experiences and so on when we talk about gender and sexuality. Okay, I'd like to bring this lecture to the closure, and I hope to see you all in my classes at WASEDA University. Okay, thank you.